The Pacific Ocean covers more than a third of the planet's surface. From above it appears continuous, unbroken, and blue. From within it, the scale becomes harder to grasp. Distances stretch beyond reference points. Horizons curve without interruption. There are no landmarks, no borders, and no reliable sense of proximity. Movement happens, but it is slow and often imperceptible. In the eastern Pacific, off the coast of Central America, the sea follows long-established patterns. Currents slide westward under the influence of trade winds and the Earth's rotation. Surface temperatures remain warm throughout the year. Storm systems form and dissolve without notice to anything below them. For vessels that remain close to shore, these conditions are predictable. For those carried outward, they become defining. The ocean is not uniformly hostile. Much of the time it is quiet. Swells lift and lower the water in regular motion. Sunlight reflects across the surface in wide, shifting planes. Nights arrive without sound. The wind, when present, does not announce its intent. It presses steadily and then moves on. Far from shipping lanes, human presence thins quickly. Small boats disappear from view within minutes of departure. Radio signals fade. Rescue infrastructure is concentrated near coasts and trade routes, not across open water. The Pacific contains regions where weeks can pass without a single vessel crossing the same space. In these areas, survival is not immediately threatened. The ocean does not rush events. It allows time to pass without intervention. Exposure builds slowly. Hunger arrives in stages. Orientation dissolves not through shock but through repetition. The absence of reference becomes the dominant condition. This is the environment in which a man would later be found. Not in crisis, not signaling, not visible from afar, simply present, carried by water that did not acknowledge him. At the outset, there was nothing to distinguish his situation from any other small craft leaving shore. The ocean was calm, the route was familiar. The isolation had not yet begun. Once a vessel moves beyond the immediate influence of land, distance becomes abstract. Coastlines fall away without ceremony. The color of the water deepens. Swells lengthen, spacing themselves farther apart. The surface loses texture. There are no fixed points to measure progress or retreat. The eastern Pacific is governed by broad, slow-moving systems. The north equatorial current pushes steadily westward, carrying debris, vegetation, and occasionally boats far from their point of origin. Wind reinforces this movement but does not control it entirely. Objects at the surface drift even when the air is still. Direction becomes something imposed from outside rather than chosen. At sea level, visibility is limited. The horizon forms a continuous ring, broken only by cloud formations. On clear days, it appears closer than it is. On overcast days, it dissolves entirely. Navigation without instruments depends on memory, sun position, and experience. When those references are removed or compromised, the sense of place weakens. Isolation at sea is not defined by solitude alone. It is defined by the absence of interruption. There is no external signal to mark time. Days are counted by light and dark, but without landmarks, they feel interchangeable. Weather shifts, but leaves no trace. Movement occurs without confirmation. Small craft are especially vulnerable to this condition. They ride low in the water and lack redundancy. Mechanical failure does not announce itself as an emergency at first. Engines stop, batteries drain, radios lose power. Each failure narrows the range of options, often without immediate consequence. In this environment, separation from land does not occur at a single moment. It accumulates. With every hour, the margin for correction decreases. Fuel limits return. Communication weakens. The current continues its work regardless of intention. For most who fish these waters, this distance is temporary. Boats return. Shore reappears. Routine resumes. The ocean permits this repetition. It does not require acknowledgement. In the case that follows, the distance did not resolve itself. It widened gradually without visible markers. There was no sudden disappearance, no immediate danger, only the steady removal of edges until direction ceased to have meaning and the sea became the only constant. José Salvador Alvarenga was born in El Salvador around 1975. Public records and later interviews place his upbringing in the coastal town of Garita Palmera, where fishing was a common occupation rather than a specialized trade. The work did not require formal training. Skills were passed informally, learned through repetition and observation. From an early age, Alvarenga spent time on the water, becoming familiar with small boats, hand lines, and the behavior of fish in nearshore currents. Economic pressure shaped his decisions. Employment options in coastal El Salvador were limited, and seasonal work was unreliable. Like many others, Alvarenga migrated north to Mexico in search of steadier income. By the early 2000s, he had settled in the fishing communities along the Pacific coast of Chiapas near the Guatemalan border. He did not operate as an independent owner. He worked as a hired fisherman, taking short trips that rarely extended beyond a day or two. The boats used in this region were small open skiffs, commonly referred to as fangas. They were designed for coastal fishing, not for long-range travel. Equipment was minimal. A typical load included an outboard motor, basic navigation lights, a small ice box for storing catch, and simple hand tools. Safety gear was limited, and emergency supplies were often absent or incomplete. Alvarenga's experience was practical rather than technical. He knew how to bait lines, clean fish, and rid changes in weather near shore. He understood the rhythm of the sea in familiar waters. His work depended on routine and predictability. Trips were planned around weather forecasts and fuel limits. Boats returned the same day whenever possible. In November 2012, Alvarenga was working out of the coastal town of Costa Azul. Fishing demand increased during certain periods, and longer trips were occasionally undertaken to reach better catch areas. These trips still remained close to land by maritime standards, though they pushed the limits of the vessels used. On the day that would later define his life, Alvarenga was not acting outside his usual role. He was assigned to a fishing trip with another crew member, Ezequiel Cordoba, a younger and less experienced fisherman. The plan did not involve extended travel or unusual risk. Supplies were loaded accordingly. Nothing in Alvarenga's background suggested preparation for long-term survival at sea. His skills were specific to short voyages and known routes. He had no training in navigation beyond sight-based orientation. He carried no charts. He did not anticipate isolation. The journey began as many others had. The familiarity of the work, the routine of departure, and the expectation of return shaped the decisions made that day. The context was ordinary. The conditions were acceptable. The outcome was not anticipated. On November 17, 2012, José Salvador Alvarenga and Ezequiel Cordoba departed from Costa Azul in a small fiberglass fishing boat powered by an outboard motor. The vessel was approximately 7 meters long. It was open to the elements and carried no cabin. The intended trip was expected to last a single day, with a return planned before nightfall. Shortly after departure, weather conditions began to change. Reports from the region indicate that a storm system developed unexpectedly. Winds increased, and wave height rose beyond what had been forecast. For boats operating near shore, such changes were not uncommon, but they required immediate response. The decision was made to continue fishing rather than return at once, a choice later described as a misjudgment rather than negligence. As the storm intensified, the boat began to take on water. Electrical systems failed early. The radio stopped functioning, removing the primary means of communication. Visibility dropped. The shoreline, already distant, became obscured by rain and spray. Orientation relied on engine power and familiarity with the general direction of land. At some point during the storm, the outboard motor failed. Accounts differ on whether it stopped due to water intake, mechanical damage, or fuel contamination. What is known is that the engine could not be restarted. Without propulsion, the boat was subject entirely to wind and current. The storm persisted for several days. During this time, the men attempted to stabilize the vessel by bailing water and securing loose equipment. They had limited fresh water and no ability to signal for help. With the radio inoperative and no flares on board, they were not visible to passing ships, even if any had been nearby. By the time the storm subsided, the boat was no longer within sight of land. The coastline of Mexico had been carried beyond the horizon. The current had moved them westward into open ocean. Fuel reserves were irrelevant without a functioning engine. Navigation was no longer possible. Search efforts were initiated along the coast after the boat failed to return. These efforts focused on expected drift patterns near shore. They did not extend far into the Pacific. The scale of the ocean made broader searches impractical. The moment of no return did not arrive with a single event. It emerged through a series of failures that compounded quietly. By the time conditions calmed, the men were adrift. The shore had been removed not by distance alone, but by the loss of every mechanism that connected them to it. Once the storm passed, the immediate threat of capsizing diminished, but the conditions of survival became clear. The boat remained afloat and structurally intact. It carried basic fishing equipment, including lines, hooks, and knives. An icebox was still on board, though the ice had melted. There was no fresh water beyond what remained in small containers, and no provisions intended for more than a day. Alvarenga and Cordoba began by assessing what could be used. Rainwater became the primary source of drinking water. They collected it using any available surface, including plastic containers and parts of the icebox lid. When rain was scarce, dehydration became an immediate concern. There was no method to desalinate seawater. Food came from the surrounding environment. Using hand lines, they caught fish when conditions allowed. Small sharks, mahi-mahi, and other pelagic species were present in the area. Without fuel to cook, the fish were consumed raw. Blood and fluids provided additional hydration. Sea turtles were captured by hand when they surfaced near the boat, providing meat that could last several days. Routine emerged out of necessity. Lines were set during daylight. Catches were cleaned and stored as best as possible. Waste was discarded to reduce odor and attract fish. The sun dictated activity. Nights were spent conserving energy, lying still to maintain body heat, and avoid unnecessary movement. Shelter was minimal. The boat offered no protection from sun or rain beyond what could be improvised with clothing and plastic. Exposure led to burns during the day and cold at night. Skin blistered and healed repeatedly. Salt accumulation caused irritation and infection. Mental discipline became as important as physical effort. Alvarenga later described maintaining focus by breaking time into manageable segments. Tasks were repeated daily to impose structure. The presence of Cordoba provided a shared routine, though their levels of endurance differed. They attempted repairs to the engine using limited tools, but without replacement parts or technical guidance, these efforts failed. The boat continued to drift westward, driven by current rather than intention. They had no means of altering course. Weeks passed without contact. Passing vessels were rare, and the boat's low profile made detection unlikely. Attempts to signal using reflective surfaces were limited in effectiveness. The scale of the ocean rendered these efforts statistically insignificant. Survival did not depend on dramatic action. It depended on consistency. The men adapted their expectations to the conditions imposed. The goal narrowed from rescue to persistence. Each day repeated the last with minor variation, shaped by weather and chance. The system they established was fragile but functional. It allowed life to continue without improvement. The ocean did not interfere. It carried them forward, indifferent to their routines, extending the interval indefinitely. As the weeks extended into months, the character of survival changed. Initial urgency gave way to endurance. The boat continued to move steadily westward, guided by the north equatorial current. This movement was not perceptible on a daily basis. There was no visible change in surroundings, only the slow repetition of water and sky. The absence of progress markers made time difficult to measure. Alvarenga and Cordoba adjusted their routines as conditions evolved. Fishing became less predictable. Some days yielded several fish, others produced none. When sharks appeared, they provided substantial food but required careful handling. Injuries occurred during capture and processing. Cuts healed slowly in saltwater. Infection remained a constant risk. Rainfall became irregular. Periods of heavy rain allowed them to replenish containers and clean their skin. Dry spells forced them to ration fluids. During these times, they reduced activity to conserve moisture. Urine was sometimes consumed in small amounts, a practice documented in survival accounts but offering limited benefit. Seawater was avoided due to its known effects. Physical decline was gradual. Weight loss was visible. Muscle mass reduced with limited nutrition. Sun exposure damaged eyes and skin. Salt sores developed where clothing rubbed against wet skin. Sleep was fragmented, interrupted by waves breaking against the hull and the need to adjust position. Navigation attempts ceased early. Without instruments or reference points, estimating direction served no practical purpose. The men understood they were drifting, but could not influence the outcome. The sun's path provided a sense of east and west, confirming their general movement but offering no control. Psychological strain increased unevenly. Cordoba struggled more visibly. His appetite declined. He became less active, participating minimally in fishing and maintenance. Alvarenga assumed more responsibility for tasks, reinforcing routine to preserve function. Conversation diminished over time, replaced by silence and observation. Debris began to appear occasionally, plastic containers, fragments of fishing gear, evidence of distant human activity carried by the same current. These objects confirmed movement, but did not indicate proximity to land. They were collected when useful and discarded when not. The boat itself deteriorated. Constant exposure weakened fittings. Saltwater corroded metal components. The icebox, once a storage tool, became a multi-purpose container. Knives dulled. Clothing disintegrated. Adaptation involved repurposing materials rather than acquiring new ones. Months passed without external contact. The men's appearance changed markedly. Hair grew long. Skin darkened and thickened. Injuries accumulated. Despite this, the basic system held. Fishing continued when possible. Water was collected when available. The routine persisted. The ocean did not present a decisive challenge. It imposed a slow attrition. Survival became a matter of tolerating repetition without reinforcement. The horizon remained unchanged. The current continued its work, carrying the boat farther from its origin with no indication of destination. This phase accounted for the majority of the journey. It lacked defining events. Its significance lay in duration. The absence of interruption became the defining condition, testing limits not through intensity, but through time. As the drift extended beyond a year, the disparity between the two men became more pronounced. Ezequiel Cordoba's health deteriorated steadily. He consumed less food and water despite availability. His physical strength declined to the point where he could no longer assist consistently with fishing or bailing. The reasons for this decline were not fully documented, though malnutrition, dehydration, and psychological stress were contributing factors. At some point during the drift, Cordoba refused to eat raw food. The consumption of uncooked fish and turtle had sustained them, but he was unable or unwilling to continue. This decision reduced his caloric intake significantly. Without alternative food sources, his condition worsened. Alvarenga continued the established routine alone. As Cordoba became increasingly inactive, he attempted to encourage participation, but there is no record of sustained recovery. The environment offered no accommodation for weakness. Tasks required daily execution regardless of physical state. Cordoba died after several months adrift. The exact date is uncertain. Estimates place his death several weeks into the drift, though some accounts suggest a longer period. There were no medical assessments, and records rely on Alvarenga's later testimony. The cause of death was attributed to starvation and dehydration. Following Cordoba's death, Alvarenga was alone on the boat. The removal of companionship altered the dynamics of survival. There was no longer shared labor or external confirmation of routine. All tasks became solitary. Silence became continuous. Alvarenga disposed of Cordoba's body by committing it to the sea, a decision consistent with maritime practice under such conditions. There was no ceremony. The act was functional, intended to maintain sanitation and mental stability. Isolation intensified psychological pressure. Without conversation or shared observation, time perception altered further. Days blended together. There were no new stimuli. The environment remained static. Physical decline continued, though Alvarenga maintained basic function. He sustained himself through fishing and rainwater collection. Injuries healed slowly. Weight loss persisted. Fatigue became constant. The loss marked a transition from shared endurance to solitary persistence. The boat continued to drift. There was no immediate change in conditions. The current remained steady. The horizon remained empty. This phase represented the narrowing of survival margins. The system remained intact, but redundancy was gone. Any injury or illness would have had no mitigation. Survival depended entirely on individual capacity and the continuation of environmental allowances. The ocean did not acknowledge the change. It maintained the same rhythm. The absence of the second man altered nothing externally, but it reshaped the internal conditions under which survival continued. In late January 2014, after approximately 14 months at sea, the boat entered the vicinity of the Marshall Islands. The transition was not immediately apparent. The water remained open, and the horizon unchanged, until low vegetation appeared intermittently. These were not clouds. They did not move. The boat reached Ebon Atoll, a remote part of the archipelago. It grounded on a coral reef near the shore. Alvarenga was physically weakened, but able to leave the vessel. He reached land without assistance and encountered local residents shortly afterward. The inhabitants of Ebon Atoll provided water and food. Medical evaluation followed once authorities were notified. Alvarenga was transported to Majuro, the capital of the Marshall Islands, where his condition was assessed. He was malnourished but stable. There were no life-threatening injuries. Verification of his account occurred over subsequent weeks. Drift analysis aligned with ocean current models. Fishing practices described matched regional methods. His physical condition was consistent with prolonged exposure and malnutrition. The rescue was not dramatic. There was no signal, no final effort. The drift ended because land intervened. The ocean released the boat without explanation. Survival was confirmed not through triumph, but through presence. The drift of José Salvador Alvarenga remains one of the longest documented solo survivals at sea. It demonstrated the capacity of ocean systems to carry a human being across vast distances without intent or awareness. Survival occurred within narrow limits, sustained by routine and chance. When it ended, the Pacific resumed its patterns unchanged, leaving only a record of endurance measured not by struggle, but by time.